"Release the K-9," the officer shouted, and the German shepherd lunged forward, then suddenly stopped inches from the old veteran, the crowd gasping as the dog's ears dropped, and a low whine replaced the attack, circling the man like it recognized something no one else could see. The veteran barely moving, whispering softly, "Easy, boy." And that's when the dog sat down instead of striking, staring up at him like a soldier awaiting orders, confusion spreading through the officers as a small, worn military tag slipped from the man's sleeve, glinting in the cold air, and in that frozen second, everything everyone believed about him began to fall apart. Sometimes, the ones we fear the most are the ones who once stood between us and chaos. The command cut through the cold afternoon air like a crack of thunder, sharp and final, and every head on the quiet street turned at once as Officer Daniel Brooks raised his hand and gave the signal, his voice steady but edged with something uncertain. "Release the K-9." The German shepherd moved instantly, powerful muscles coiling beneath its dark coat, paws striking the pavement in quick, controlled bursts as it closed the distance toward the old man standing alone near the edge of the sidewalk, a man who hadn't moved, not even an inch, despite the tension gathering around him like a storm waiting to break. Thomas Hale stood with his shoulders slightly hunched beneath a worn brown jacket, the fabric thin at the elbows, his gray hair stirred gently by a passing wind that carried the faint scent of rain and asphalt, and though his clothes spoke of hardship, there was something in the way he held himself, something quiet and steady, like a memory of discipline that refused to fade. The crowd had already decided who he was, their whispers threading through the air, low and certain, a dangerous man, unstable, someone to be feared. Yet Thomas did not argue, did not raise his voice, his eyes simply resting on the approaching dog with a calm that didn't match the moment. The K-9, Rex, was trained for precision, for obedience, for situations exactly like this, his handler trusting him more than instinct itself. And yet as he drew closer, something shifted, subtle at first, almost invisible, the dog's stride faltering by a fraction, his ears tilting forward not in aggression but in focus, as if he were listening to something deeper than commands. A faint sound left his throat, not a bark, not a warning, but something softer, uncertain, and for a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath, the wind quieting, the distant hum of traffic fading into nothing, leaving only the sound of Rex's paws slowing against the pavement. Thomas's hand moved slightly, not in defense, but in a gesture so small it could have been missed, his fingers loosening at his side, his voice barely more than a whisper carried by the air. "Easy, boy." The words hung there, simple and unforced, yet they carried a weight that reached beyond the moment, and Rex stopped, just a few feet away now, his body no longer poised to act, but to understand. Amber eyes locked onto the man as if searching through layers of time for something familiar, something remembered. Officer Brooks felt it then, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself, but settles into your chest and refuses to leave. And around him, the murmurs faded, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any noise, because something about the scene no longer fit the story they had all believed. Rex took one slow step forward, then another, not as a weapon, but as something else entirely, something closer to recognition, his head lowering slightly, his tail still, his focus unwavering. And in that quiet, suspended moment, it became clear that whatever was about to happen next was not what anyone had expected. The air did not move, yet something unseen passed through the space between the dog and the man, something older than commands and louder than the silence pressing in on the street, and Rex lowered his head just slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, his breathing slowing as if he were adjusting to a rhythm only he could hear, while Thomas Hale stood as he had before, steady and quiet, his eyes soft but focused, watching the dog not with fear, but with a kind of understanding that did not need words. Officer Daniel Brooks tightened his grip on the leash handle still clipped to Rex's harness, confusion tightening across his face as he gave a second command, sharper this time, more urgent, the kind that had never been ignored, and yet Rex did not respond the way he was trained to, instead shifting his weight forward by inches, nose lifting toward the man's hand, as if following a faint trail carried through time rather than air. Around them, The crowd leaned in, their earlier certainty dissolving into uneasy whispers, the kind that rise when something no longer makes sense, when a story begins to crack under its own weight. And Brooks felt it too, that subtle fracture forming beneath the surface of everything he thought he understood. Rex circled once, slow and deliberate, his paws making soft contact with the pavement, each step measured, careful, his eyes never leaving Thomas. And then he stopped directly in front of him, close enough now to feel the warmth of the man's presence, close enough to notice details no human eye had yet taken the time to see. The faint tremor in Thomas's fingers, the worn fabric at his cuffs, the way his shoulders carried not just years, but memory. Thomas exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cool air, and there was something about the way he stood, something in the angle of his posture, that felt practiced, almost instinctive, as if his body remembered structure even when the world around him had forgotten him. And Rex responded to that without hesitation, his ears easing back slightly, his tail lowering not in fear, but in calm, a signal that did not belong to threat, but to trust. "What is wrong with him?" someone in the crowd murmured, their voice breaking the fragile quiet. But no one answered, because no one truly knew, and Brooks felt a flicker of doubt move through him, small but undeniable, the kind that grows when reality refuses to follow expectation. He stepped forward, cautious now, his boots scraping lightly against the ground, his eyes shifting between the dog and the man as he tried to regain control of a situation that no longer felt entirely his. "Rex," he called again, softer this time, testing rather than commanding, but the dog did not look back, did not break his focus, as if the world behind him had faded into irrelevance. Instead, Rex took one final step closer, lowering his nose toward Thomas's hand, hovering there for a moment before gently pressing forward, inhaling deeply. And something changed in that instant, something invisible yet unmistakable, because the dog's entire body softened, tension releasing, as if a long-held question had just been answered. Thomas's fingers moved slightly, almost hesitant, as if unsure whether the moment was real, and then he let his hand rest just enough for contact, his voice barely audible as he spoke again. "It is all right," the words carrying a quiet steadiness that seemed to settle into the air itself. Brooks felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from something harder to define, something that did not fit into procedure or protocol, and he glanced briefly at the onlookers, their expressions mirroring his own uncertainty, the earlier judgment now replaced by something closer to curiosity, even doubt. A faint metallic sound broke the stillness, small but sharp enough to draw attention, and Thomas shifted slightly, as something slipped from the loose seam of his jacket sleeve, falling against the pavement with a soft, deliberate tap, and for a moment no one moved, as if the object itself carried weight beyond its size. Rex noticed it first, of course, his ears flicking as his gaze dropped, his nose following, and he stepped back just enough to look at it, then back at Thomas, as if connecting pieces of a puzzle no one else could yet see. Brooks crouched slowly, careful not to startle the fragile calm that had settled over the scene, and reached toward the object, his fingers closing around a small, worn tag, its surface scratched by time, edges dulled by years of use. And as he turned it over, the faint engraving caught the light, numbers and letters etched with purpose, not decoration. His brow furrowed as he read it, recognition flickering at the edge of his understanding, something about it familiar, something he had seen before in training manuals, in old briefings, in stories told by men who had served long before him. And when he looked back up at Thomas, really looked this time, the pieces began to shift, slowly, but undeniably. Rex let out a low, quiet sound again, softer than before, almost like a memory-given voice, and he sat down directly in front of Thomas, posture straight, attentive, not as a dog waiting for a command, but as one acknowledging it had already been given, long ago, in a different place, under different circumstances. The crowd fell completely silent now, the kind of silence that does not come from fear, but from realization, from the understanding that something important is unfolding, something that cannot be undone once seen, and Brooks felt it settle into him fully, that the moment had crossed a line, that whatever they thought this man was, whatever they believed they were responding to, was no longer certain. Thomas looked down at Rex, his expression unchanged on the surface. But something deeper moved beneath it, something quiet and old. And for the first time since the scene began, there was a faint shift in his eyes, not relief, not quite, but recognition returned, as if something lost had just found its way back. And in that fragile, suspended second, it became clear that the truth was no longer hidden. It was simply waiting to be understood. There are moments when truth does not arrive as a loud revelation, but as a quiet shift that no one can ignore once it begins. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt that shift settle deeper into his chest as he stared down at the worn metal tag resting in his palm, its surface dulled by time, yet still carrying a presence that refused to fade. The engraved numbers catching the pale afternoon light, as if they were trying to be seen again after years of silence. He turned it slightly, his thumb brushing over the edges, and something about its weight felt different, not just metal, but memory, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. And when he looked up again at Thomas Hale, really looked this time, the image in front of him no longer aligned with the story he had been told just minutes earlier. The man did not stand like someone lost or dangerous. He stood like someone who had once known structure so deeply that even time could not fully take it away, his posture quiet but grounded, his breathing steady in a way that did not match fear. And Brooks felt a subtle unease rise, not from threat, but from the realization that he might have misunderstood something important. Around them, the crowd had grown still, the earlier murmurs replaced by a silence that felt heavier than before, as if each person was waiting for someone else to explain what they were seeing, yet no one stepped forward, because the moment no longer belonged to assumptions. It belonged to something unfolding in real time. Rex remained seated in front of Thomas, his body calm, his attention unwavering, and there was a kind of discipline in the way he held himself that Brooks recognized instantly, but could not yet place, the kind that came from training, yes, but also from trust. And that trust was not directed at the officer holding his lead, it was directed at the man standing quietly before him. Brooks exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a controlled release, and he rose to his feet, the tag still in his hand as he took a cautious step closer, his voice lower now, stripped of command, carrying instead a careful uncertainty. "Where did you get this?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, yet it carried more weight than the words themselves, because it was no longer about procedure, it was about understanding. Thomas did not answer immediately, his gaze resting briefly on the tag before returning to Rex. And for a moment it seemed as though the answer might never come, as though the silence itself was part of the story. But then he spoke, his voice quiet, worn by time yet steady. "It has been with me longer than most things have." And though the sentence was simple, there was something in the way he said it that suggested layers, history, pieces not yet revealed. Brooks felt a flicker of recognition push further into place, something forming at the edge of his thoughts, and he glanced again at Rex, whose posture had not changed, whose attention had not wavered, as if the dog was holding the moment steady until the truth could catch up. "Rex," Brooks said again, softer now, almost testing, and this time the dog's ears shifted slightly at the sound of his name, but he did not move, did not break his focus, and that was when Brooks understood something he had never experienced before, that obedience was not being ignored, it was being redirected. The realization settled into him slowly, like light breaking through a cloud, and he looked back at Thomas with a different kind of awareness, one that replaced suspicion with something closer to respect, though he could not yet explain why. A faint movement at the edge of the scene drew his attention, and he noticed an elderly woman standing a few steps behind the crowd, her posture unsteady but her gaze fixed firmly on Thomas, her expression not fearful, but concerned, as though she had been trying to speak and had not been heard. And when their eyes met, she gave a small, almost hesitant nod, as if confirming something without words. Brooks turned slightly, his voice carrying just enough to reach her. "Ma'am, do you know this man?" And she stepped forward slowly, the movement cautious but determined, her hands clasped lightly in front of her as she approached, the crowd parting just enough to let her through. "He was not harming anyone," she said, her voice thin but clear, each word placed with care. "He was helping me." And the statement landed softly, yet it carried more impact than any raised voice could have, because it shifted the foundation of everything that had led to this moment. Brooks felt the last of his certainty dissolve, replaced now by the need to understand fully, to see clearly what had been hidden beneath assumption. And he looked once more at Thomas, at Rex, at the tag in his hand, and the pieces began to align, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough to change the direction of the moment entirely. Rex finally moved, but not away, not toward aggression. Instead, he lowered himself further, resting calmly at Thomas's feet, his presence no longer a question, but an answer, and in that quiet gesture, something unspoken passed between them. Something rooted in a time before this street, before this misunderstanding, something built on trust that did not fade. Brooks inhaled slowly, the air cool against his lungs, and for the first time since arriving, he removed his hand from the lead entirely, allowing it to hang loose, a small action, but one that marked a shift in everything, because the situation was no longer about control, it was about truth. And as the afternoon light softened across the pavement, casting long shadows that stretched quietly beneath their feet, it became clear that what had seemed like a moment of conflict was in fact something else entirely, something that had been waiting to be recognized, and now, finally, was beginning to be seen. Truth does not rush to defend itself, it waits until someone is finally ready to see it. The words seemed to settle quietly into the moment, though no one could say exactly where they came from, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt them. More than he heard them as he stood there with the worn tag still resting in his hand, its cool surface grounding him in a reality that was shifting beneath his feet. The elderly woman, Margaret Quinn, moved closer now, her steps slow but certain, the faint creak of her shoes against the pavement echoing softly in the silence that had taken hold of the street, and when she reached Thomas Hale, she did not hesitate, did not question. She simply placed a gentle hand near his arm, not quite touching, but close enough to show what words had already begun to reveal, that he was not a threat, that he had never been. Thomas glanced at her briefly, his expression unchanged on the surface, yet something softened in his eyes, something that spoke of recognition, of shared understanding, and then his gaze returned to Rex, who remained at his feet, calm and steady, as if guarding not the man, but the truth that had just begun to unfold. Brooks cleared his throat quietly, the sound small but noticeable in the stillness, and he stepped forward one more time, closing the distance not with authority, but with intention, his voice lower now, more measured. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" The question was no longer an accusation, it was an invitation, and Margaret nodded slowly, her breath visible in the cool air as she gathered her thoughts, her eyes flicking briefly to the crowd before returning to the officer. "I was crossing the street," she began, her voice steady despite its age. "I did not see the step near the curb, and I lost my balance." She paused, her hand tightening slightly at her side. "He caught me before I fell." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, almost too simple, and yet it carried a weight that pressed against every assumption that had been made just moments earlier. Brooks felt his grip on the tag loosen slightly, his fingers relaxing as the pieces aligned further, and he looked back at Thomas, searching now not for signs of danger, but for confirmation of something deeper. Thomas did not defend himself, did not elaborate. He simply stood as he had before, quiet, composed, as if the need to explain had long since left him, replaced by a kind of patience that only time could teach. Rex shifted slightly, adjusting his position so that he was closer to Thomas's leg, his body angled protectively yet without tension, and the movement did not go unnoticed, not by Brooks, not by the crowd, because it reinforced what was already becoming clear, that the dog's instincts were not reacting to a threat, they were responding to something familiar, something trusted. A faint breeze moved through the street, carrying with it the distant hum of a passing car, the world beginning to return to motion after being held still for so long. And Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he made a decision that did not require orders, only understanding. He reached down and clipped the lead securely to Rex's harness again, not to restrain him, but out of habit, and when he did, Rex finally glanced back at him, just briefly, his amber eyes meeting the officer's in a way that felt almost human, as if acknowledging the shift that had taken place. Brooks nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, and then he turned his attention fully to Thomas, extending the tag back toward him, his hand steady. "This belongs to you." Thomas looked at the tag for a moment before taking it, his fingers closing around it with a familiarity that spoke of years rather than days. And as he slipped it back into his jacket, there was a quiet finality to the gesture, as if something important had been returned to its place. Margaret let out a soft breath, the tension leaving her posture as she stepped back just slightly, her eyes moving between the two men, and there was a faint smile there now, not one of relief alone, but of something deeper, something closer to gratitude. The crowd began to shift as well, the earlier certainty replaced by a kind of subdued reflection, people exchanging glances, some lowering their heads slightly, as if recognizing that they had been too quick to judge, too ready to believe the worst. Brooks straightened, his posture no longer rigid, but composed, and he spoke again, this time not as an officer addressing a situation, but as one man speaking to another. "Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding." The words were simple, but they carried weight, and Thomas nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not dismissive, not triumphant, just accepting, as if apologies were not new to him, as if he had heard them before, in different places, under different circumstances. Rex remained where he was, his presence steady, his breathing calm, and as the moment began to settle into something quieter, something more human, it became clear that the true shift had not been in the dog, but in the way everyone else had finally begun to see what he had known from the very beginning. And in that gentle, almost unnoticed transformation, something else emerged, something that did not need to be spoken aloud, because it was already understood that sometimes the clearest truths are the ones revealed not by words, but by the quiet certainty of a loyal heart. Not every apology fixes the past, but sometimes it opens a door the past thought was closed forever. The street slowly began to breathe again, as if the tension that had gripped it moments ago was finally loosening its hold, and people shifted their weight, some stepping back, others lowering their voices, the sharp edges of judgment softening into something quieter, something more reflective. Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, though his posture had changed, the rigid certainty replaced by a calm attentiveness, his eyes still on Thomas Hale, as if trying to understand more than what had just happened, as if sensing that this moment was only the surface of something deeper. Thomas adjusted his jacket slightly, the worn fabric settling back into place as he slipped the tag securely inside, his movements slow, deliberate, the kind that come from habit rather than urgency, and when he looked up again, his gaze moved not to the officer, but to Rex, who remained close, his presence steady and unwavering, as though the bond between them had not just been revealed, but remembered. There was a quiet pause, the kind that carries weight without needing to be filled, and then Brooks spoke again, his voice careful, almost thoughtful. "You said it has been with you a long time." He nodded toward the pocket where the tag now rested. "Were you military?" The question was simple, but it carried a different tone now, one of respect rather than suspicion, and Thomas took a moment before answering, his eyes drifting briefly toward the horizon where the afternoon light had begun to soften into a pale gold. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady. "A long time ago." There was no elaboration, no attempt to explain further, and yet the way he said it suggested that the story behind that single word was far from simple, layered with years that could not be reduced to a sentence. Brooks nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pressing, though the curiosity remained, not intrusive, but present, and he glanced again at Rex, who had not moved far, his ears occasionally flicking as if listening to something beyond the reach of human hearing, yet always returning his attention to Thomas, as if anchored there by something stronger than training alone. Margaret Quinn stepped a little closer again, her hands now resting more comfortably at her sides, her earlier tension replaced by a gentle steadiness, and she looked at Thomas with a softness that came not from pity, but from recognition. "You should not be out here alone," she said quietly, her voice carrying concern rather than instruction. "It is getting colder this time of year." Thomas gave a small nod, acknowledging her words, though he did not respond directly, and there was something in that silence that spoke of familiarity, as if being alone was not a new condition, but one he had come to accept over time. The breeze moved again, slightly stronger now, brushing against coats and carrying with it the faint scent of distant rain, and Brooks shifted his stance, his boots making a soft sound against the pavement as he considered his next words carefully. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked, not as an officer, but as a man trying to understand another's situation, and Thomas paused for a moment, the question settling between them, before giving a quiet answer. "I manage." It was not a denial, nor was it an invitation for help. It was simply a statement, one that carried a quiet dignity, the kind that does not ask for more than what it already has. Brooks felt something tighten in his chest again, not discomfort, but a growing awareness of the space between what was seen and what was lived, and he glanced briefly at Margaret, who seemed to understand the same thing without needing it spoken aloud. Rex shifted once more, this time rising to his feet slowly, his movement calm and unhurried, and he stepped closer to Thomas again, positioning himself just slightly ahead, not blocking, not guarding, but present in a way that felt intentional. And when Thomas's hand moved, resting lightly against the side of the dog's neck, it was clear that the connection between them was not something that had just formed. It was something that had existed long before this moment, something that had endured. Brooks noticed it, of course, the subtle way Thomas's hand moved with familiarity, the ease in the gesture, and it stirred a question he had not yet asked, one that lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. The crowd had begun to disperse now, slowly, quietly, people returning to their routines, though many cast one last glance over their shoulders, as if reluctant to fully leave behind what they had witnessed, and the street, though still the same, felt different somehow, as if it had absorbed the moment and would carry it forward in ways no one could fully explain. Brooks took a small step closer again, his voice lower now, almost reflective. "He trusted you," he said, nodding toward Rex, "before any of us did." And Thomas looked at the dog for a moment before responding, his voice soft but certain. "Dogs remember things people forget." The words settled into the space between them, simple yet profound, and Brooks felt them linger, echoing in a way that reached beyond the moment itself. Rex lifted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the statement, his eyes calm, his presence steady, and in that quiet exchange, something deeper revealed itself, something that was not about the misunderstanding that had just been resolved, but about the connection that had made that resolution possible in the first place. And as the light continued to fade gently across the street, casting long, quiet shadows that stretched between them, it became clear that this was not just the end of a misunderstanding, but the beginning of a question that had yet to be fully answered, one that lingered in the stillness, waiting patiently, just like the truth had done all along. Sometimes the question is not who a man is, but why no one stayed long enough to find out. The words seemed to linger in the cooling air as the last few people drifted away, their footsteps fading into the quiet rhythm of the late afternoon, leaving behind a space that felt less crowded but somehow heavier, as if what had just happened had settled into the ground beneath them. Officer Daniel Brooks remained still for a moment longer, his gaze resting on Thomas Hale and the German shepherd beside him, the image no longer one of tension, but of something quieter, something harder to define, and he found himself reluctant to break it. The streetlights had not yet come on, but the light had shifted enough to soften edges, turning sharp lines into gentle shadows that stretched across the pavement. And in that softened world, Thomas did not look like a man out of place. He looked like someone who had simply been standing there all along, waiting for the world to catch up. Brooks finally moved, taking a slow step closer, not out of duty, but out of something that felt closer to responsibility, though he could not quite name it. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the urgency from before, only a quiet intention. "You ever worked with dogs?" he asked, though the answer already seemed to rest somewhere in the air between them, unspoken but present. Thomas glanced down at Rex briefly, his hand resting lightly along the dog's neck, fingers moving just enough to trace a familiar line. And there was a pause before he answered, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing how much to give. "A long time ago," he said, his voice steady, the same quiet tone that seemed to carry more than it revealed. Brooks nodded slightly, absorbing the answer, and for a moment he looked away, toward the empty stretch of street, as if giving the man space to keep his silence, but something in him pressed forward again, not as an officer now, but as someone who had seen enough to know when a story deserved to be heard. He responded to you like you were still giving commands, Brooks said, his eyes returning to Rex, who now stood calmly beside Thomas, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as though waiting for something that had not yet been asked. Thomas did not immediately respond, his gaze shifting instead toward the horizon where the sky had begun to fade into a muted gray-blue, and when he finally spoke, his words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deeply. Some things you do long enough, they stay with you, he said. And Rex's ears flicked slightly at the sound of his voice, a subtle confirmation that whatever bond existed between them was not something formed in a single moment, but something carried across years. Margaret Quinn stepped forward again, her presence gentle but persistent, as if she understood that the moment was not over, only unfolding more slowly now. You should come by my place, she said softly, her eyes kind but firm. It is just a few blocks down, and I have extra space. She hesitated briefly. No one should be out here when the nights start turning cold. Thomas looked at her, really looked this time, and there was something in his expression that shifted, not resistance, but consideration, the kind that comes when an offer touches something deeper than convenience. He did not answer right away, and Brooks watched that hesitation with quiet awareness, understanding that for some people, accepting help was not simple, it was complicated by things that could not be seen. Rex moved slightly closer to Thomas, his shoulder brushing lightly against the man's leg, a small gesture, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried a quiet encouragement, as if the dog sensed the weight of the moment and responded in the only way he knew how. Brooks exhaled slowly, the cool air steadying him as he reached a decision that felt less like protocol and more like instinct. She is right, he said, his voice calm. It is going to drop below 40 degrees tonight. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You do not have to figure everything out right now, just not out here. Thomas's eyes shifted between them, Margaret's quiet concern, Brooks's measured sincerity, and then down to Rex, who stood patiently, as if waiting for a choice that had already begun to form. There was a long pause, not uncomfortable, but meaningful, the kind that carries the weight of change, and then Thomas gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough. Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly, a soft breath escaping her as she offered a gentle smile, not triumphant, not relieved in a dramatic way, but warm, steady, as if she had expected this outcome all along. Brooks felt something settle in his chest, a quiet sense of completion, though he knew this was not the end of the story, only the beginning of something else, something that would unfold beyond this street, beyond. This moment, Rex shifted his stance, stepping forward as Thomas turned slightly, aligning himself naturally at the man's side, not leading, not following, but walking with him. And as they began to move, slowly, deliberately, the street seemed to release them without resistance. Brooks remained where he was for a moment longer, watching them go, the image of the man and the dog fading gradually into the softening light, and he realized that what had happened here was not just a misunderstanding corrected, but something quieter, something more lasting, a reminder that sometimes the truth does not need to be uncovered, it only needs to be recognized by those willing to see it. Sometimes the hardest step is not the first one forward, but the moment you allow yourself to follow someone else's light. The sidewalk stretched quietly ahead, its concrete surface catching the last traces of daylight as Thomas Hale walked beside Margaret Quinn, his pace steady but measured, as if each step carried both weight and hesitation, while Rex moved at his side with an ease that suggested this path, whatever it was, had already been accepted by him. The town around them had begun to settle into its evening rhythm, distant doors closing, faint voices drifting through the cooling air, and somewhere far off, the low hum of a passing car faded into the background, leaving behind a calm that felt almost unfamiliar after the tension of the earlier moment. Margaret walked slightly ahead, her steps careful but confident, as if she had made this short journey countless times before, her small frame moving with a quiet determination that did not draw attention, yet did not waver, and every now and then she glanced back, not to check if Thomas was following, but to make sure he had not changed his mind. Thomas noticed it. Of course, the subtle way she looked back, the unspoken concern in her eyes, and though he said nothing, there was a faint shift in his expression, something softer, something less guarded, as if the distance between where he stood and where he was going had begun to feel a little less uncertain. Rex stayed close, his shoulder occasionally brushing against Thomas's leg, a silent reassurance that did not ask for acknowledgement, only presence, and every time Thomas's hand drifted slightly toward the dog, even without touching, Rex responded with the smallest adjustment, as if the connection between them operated on something deeper than contact alone. The streetlights flickered on one by one as they moved further down the block, casting warm pools of light onto the pavement, and in those gentle circles of illumination, Thomas's figure no longer seemed lost or out of place, but grounded, as though he belonged in the scene in a way that had not been visible before. "It is just up ahead," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying back to him, not loud, but clear enough to guide, and Thomas gave a small nod, though she did not see it, his eyes focused ahead as the outline of a modest home came into view, its porch light already glowing, a quiet invitation against the deepening dusk. The house was simple, white siding slightly worn by time, a small wooden porch with a single chair resting near the door, and a faint golden light spilling from the windows, steady and warm, the kind of light that suggested not just shelter, but something else, something harder to name, something that felt like it had been waiting. Margaret stepped onto the porch first, her hand reaching for the railing as she climbed the 2 short steps, and she paused there, turning back once more, this time not out of concern, but to offer something unspoken, a silent reassurance that the space beyond the door was not just hers, but could be shared. Thomas stopped at the base of the steps, his gaze lifting toward the house, taking in the details, the light, the stillness, the quiet promise it held, and for a moment he did not move, as if standing at the edge of something larger than a doorway, something that required more than just a step forward. Rex looked up at him, his ears tilting slightly, his eyes steady, patient, and there was no urgency in his posture, only a quiet expectation, as if he understood that some decisions could not be rushed, only waited for. Thomas exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cool evening air, and then, with a movement that was almost imperceptible, he shifted his weight and stepped forward, placing his foot onto the first step, the wood creaking softly beneath him, a small sound, but one that seemed to mark the moment with quiet certainty. Margaret smiled gently as she opened the door, the hinges making a soft, familiar sound, and the warmth from inside spilled outward, brushing against the cool air, carrying with it the faint scent of something comforting, something lived in, something real. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside to make space, and Thomas paused just inside the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the light, his posture still, as if allowing himself a moment to take in the shift, the difference between outside and in, between what had been and what might be. Rex stepped in beside him without hesitation, his paws moving across the wooden floor with quiet confidence, as if he had already accepted the space, already claimed it in some small way, and when Thomas finally followed, crossing fully into the room, the door closed softly behind them, not with finality, but with a kind of gentle closure that did not trap, only held. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, something changed again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a man allows himself to stand still in a place that does not ask him to leave, and in the way a loyal dog settles beside him, as if to say that sometimes the hardest journeys do not lead far, they simply lead somewhere that feels like it might finally be enough. A house is not made warm by walls, but by the memories it is willing to hold. The quiet inside Margaret Quinn's home settled gently around them, wrapping the space in a calm that felt different from the outside world, softer, slower, as if time itself had chosen to move with more care within these walls. Thomas Hale stood just a few steps inside the doorway, his eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in the details without urgency, the worn wooden floor that carried faint marks of years gone by, the small table near the window with a neatly folded cloth, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light across the corners that did not need to be filled. Rex moved first, his paws making soft, steady contact with the floor as he walked further into the room, his nose lifting slightly as he took in the scent of the space, not searching, not alert, but curious in a quiet, measured way, as though confirming that this place held no harm, only stillness. Margaret closed the door behind them with a Gentle push, the sound soft but certain, and she turned back with a small smile, her presence grounded, welcoming without being overwhelming. "It is not much," she said, though the words carried no apology, only honesty, "but it is warm." And Thomas gave a slight nod, his gaze settling briefly on the lamp before returning to her, as if acknowledging not the size of the space, but the intention behind it. Rex circled once near the center of the room before lowering himself onto the floor, his body relaxing in a way that spoke louder than words, his breathing steady, his eyes still alert, but no longer searching, and Thomas noticed it. Of course, the way the dog had already accepted the space, already allowed himself to rest, and there was something in that quiet decision that reached deeper than the room itself. Margaret moved toward the kitchen, her steps slow but familiar, the soft clink of a kettle being set onto the stove breaking the silence just enough to feel alive, and the faint sound of running water followed, steady and calming, like a quiet rhythm that did not demand attention, only presence. Thomas remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture still, his hands resting loosely at his sides, as if he was allowing himself to adjust, not just to the room, but to the idea of being inside again, of standing in a place that did not ask him to move on. The air carried a gentle warmth, not heavy, but enough to soften the edges of the chill that had followed him in, and he exhaled slowly, the breath no longer visible, absorbed into the quiet comfort of the space. "You can sit," Margaret called from the kitchen, her voice light but certain, and Thomas glanced toward a chair near the table, its surface worn smooth from use, the kind of wear that spoke of time rather than neglect, and after a brief pause, he moved toward it, his steps unhurried, each one deliberate, until he reached it and lowered himself down, the wood creaking softly beneath him as if acknowledging his presence. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching the movement, and then rested it back down again, satisfied, as though the simple act of sitting had completed something important. Margaret returned a moment later, carrying 2 cups, the steam rising gently into the air, and she placed one in front of Thomas without a word, the gesture quiet, natural, as if it required no explanation, and he looked at it for a moment before wrapping his hands around it, feeling the warmth through his fingers, a small sensation, but one that seemed to settle deeper than expected. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full in a different way, carrying a sense of calm that did not need to be filled with conversation, and Thomas found himself sitting there without the need to leave, without the pull to move on, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to notice. Rex shifted slightly on the floor, his body turning just enough so that he faced Thomas more directly, his eyes half closed but aware, and there was a quiet loyalty in that position, a presence that did not demand attention, only offered it. Margaret sat across from Thomas, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze gentle but observant, and she did not ask questions, did not press for answers. She simply sat, allowing the moment to be what it was, and in that restraint, there was a kind of understanding that went beyond words. Outside, the wind moved softly against the house, brushing against the windows with a faint, rhythmic sound, and the world continued as it always had. But inside, something had shifted, something small yet significant, something that did not announce itself, but settled quietly into place. Thomas lifted the cup slightly, taking a slow sip, the warmth spreading through him in a way that felt both simple and profound, and as he lowered it again, his gaze drifted briefly to Rex, who remained steady and calm, and then to Margaret, who met his eyes with a quiet nod, as if to say that nothing more needed to be said in that moment. And in that gentle stillness, where no one demanded anything and nothing needed to be proven, it became clear that sometimes the most important changes do not come from grand gestures, but from the quiet acceptance of a place where you are finally allowed to rest. Some stories do not begin when we meet a person, but when we finally choose to listen to the silence they carry. The room remained quiet, not empty, but full in a way that did not ask to be filled. The soft ticking of a small clock on the wall marking time in steady, patient intervals while the warmth from the lamp and the kettle lingered gently in the air. Thomas Hale sat with the cup resting between his hands, the heat slowly fading into something more subtle, more lasting, and his eyes drifted across the room again, not searching, but remembering, as if the stillness around him had stirred something long set aside. Rex shifted slightly on the floor, his breathing calm, his presence steady, and every now and then his ears flicked toward the quiet sounds of the house, the settling wood, the faint hum of the stove, small details that most would not notice. Yet he held them all with quiet awareness, as though confirming that this place was safe enough to rest, safe enough to let time pass without urgency. Margaret Quinn watched Thomas with a patience that did not press, her hands folded lightly near her cup, her gaze kind but observant, and she seemed to understand that some moments needed space more than questions. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but meaningful, until Thomas finally spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of someone unused to being heard. "It has been a long time since I have sat like this," he said, his eyes still on the cup, the words simple but carrying more than they revealed. Margaret nodded gently, not surprised, not curious in a way that demanded more, only acknowledging what had been offered. "Sometimes stillness feels unfamiliar when you have lived too long without it," she replied softly, her voice calm, as if speaking from experience rather than assumption. Thomas lifted his gaze slightly, meeting hers for a brief moment, and there was something in that exchange, something quiet and mutual, as if both understood that certain parts of life were not easily explained, only recognized. Rex raised his head then, his eyes moving between them, not in confusion, but in attention, and he let out a soft breath before resting his chin back down, his presence unchanged, steady, loyal, as though he had already accepted that this moment was not about movement, but about staying. The clock ticked on, each second passing with a quiet certainty, and outside, the wind brushed softly against the walls, a faint reminder of the world beyond the warmth of the room. Thomas set the cup down gently, the sound of ceramic meeting with soft but clear, and his hand lingered there for a moment before he spoke again, this time not as carefully, but with a little more weight behind his words. "I used to work with dogs," he said, his voice steady, though quieter now, as if the memory itself carried its own gravity. Margaret did not interrupt, did not ask for clarification. She simply listened, her stillness offering space for the words to continue if they chose to. "Search and rescue," Thomas added after a moment, his gaze shifting slightly toward Rex, who lifted his head again at the sound of his voice, his ears tilting forward in quiet recognition. "A long time ago." The words settled into the room, not heavy, but meaningful, and Margaret nodded once, slowly, as if placing the pieces together without needing them spelled out. "That explains a great deal," she said softly, her eyes briefly moving to Rex before returning to Thomas, and there was no surprise in her tone, only understanding. Thomas gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, his hand resting lightly against the table, and there was a pause again, but this time it felt different, less guarded, as though something had shifted just enough to allow more to exist beneath the surface. Rex rose slowly to his feet, his movement unhurried, and he stepped closer to Thomas, positioning himself near the chair, his presence calm but attentive, and when Thomas's hand moved, resting gently along the side of the dog's neck, it was not a hesitant gesture, it was familiar, practiced, the kind that came from years rather than moments. The contact was brief, but it carried weight, a quiet confirmation of something that had been sensed from the beginning, something that no one needed to explain anymore. Margaret watched the exchange with a small, knowing smile, not intrusive, not sentimental, just present, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, giving the moment room to exist without interruption. "You must have seen a lot," she said after a while, her voice still soft, still careful, and Thomas did not answer right away, his gaze drifting slightly, not away from the room, but inward, as if searching through memories that did not come easily to the surface. "Enough," he said finally, the word simple, yet carrying a depth that suggested far more than it revealed. The silence returned again, but this time it felt fuller, more complete, as though it held not just the present moment, but the beginnings of something else, something that might unfold slowly, piece by piece, if given the time and space to do so. Outside, the wind softened, the night settling in around the house with a quiet certainty, and inside, the light remained steady, warm, unchanged, a quiet constant in a world that often moved too quickly. Thomas leaned back slightly in the chair, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders easing just enough to show that something within him had shifted, even if only slightly, and Rex remained close, his presence unwavering, as though he understood that this was not just a place to rest, but a place where something long buried might finally begin to surface. And in that quiet room, where words were few but meaning was deep, it became clear that some stories do not need to be told all at once. They only need a place where they are finally allowed to begin. Some bonds are not remembered by the mind, but by something deeper that never forgets. The words seemed to settle quietly into the space between them, carried not by sound but by the weight of what had already been shared, and Thomas Hale sat still for a long moment after speaking, his eyes resting on nothing in particular, as if the memory he had opened had not yet finished unfolding. The room remained warm, the soft glow of the lamp steady, the ticking clock marking time with quiet patience, and Rex stayed close, his presence unchanged, yet there was a subtle alertness in him now, a shift so slight it could be missed, as though the name Carter, though unfamiliar, had stirred something instinctive within him. Margaret Quinn leaned forward just slightly, her hands still resting gently together, her expression calm, receptive, and she did not interrupt the silence that followed, understanding that some memories do not come all at once, they arrive in pieces, each one carrying its own weight. Thomas drew in a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling with quiet control, and then he spoke again, his voice softer now, as if the words themselves required care. "There was a day," he said, his gaze drifting toward the floor, "when the ground did not feel solid anymore. Everything shifted without warning." He paused there, not searching for words, but allowing the memory to settle, and Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears angling forward in quiet attention, as though responding to something in the tone rather than the meaning. "We were called in to search," Thomas continued. "A collapsed structure. People trapped. No clear way in." His hand moved slightly on the table, fingers curling just enough to hold onto the present, and though his voice remained steady, there was a depth beneath it now, something that spoke of moments that had not faded with time. Margaret's gaze softened, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding, and she remained still, offering nothing but her presence, the kind that does not interrupt, only supports. "Carter found them," Thomas said after a moment, and the simplicity of the statement carried a quiet certainty. "He always did." Rex shifted closer, his body leaning just slightly toward Thomas, his presence steady, as if anchoring the moment, and Thomas's hand moved without thought, resting lightly against the dog's shoulder, the contact brief but grounding. "He would listen," Thomas continued, his voice quieter still, "not just for sound, but for life." The words lingered in the air, and the room seemed to hold them, absorbing their meaning without needing explanation. Margaret nodded once, slowly, her expression unchanged, yet there was a quiet respect in her eyes, not for the story itself, but for the way it was being shared. Thomas exhaled again, a little longer this time, and his gaze returned to the present, to the table, the cup, the steady light, and for a moment, he did not speak, as if deciding how much more to let the memory surface. Rex remained close, his breathing calm, his eyes steady, and there was something in the way he stayed that felt deliberate, as though he understood that this was not just a story, but something that required presence. "That day," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying a subtle shift, something deeper, "he did not hesitate, even when the rest of us did." The words settled, and there was a quiet pause that followed, not heavy, but full, as if the moment itself needed time to breathe. Margaret's hands tightened just slightly in her lap, not from discomfort, but from the weight of what she was hearing, and she leaned back just enough to give the space more room. Thomas's eyes moved briefly toward Rex, and there was something in that glance, something unspoken, as if the presence beside him was not just companionship, but a reflection of something he had once known. "Dogs like that," Thomas continued, his voice soft, almost reflective, "they do not just follow commands, they choose to trust." Rex's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, and he lifted his head just enough to meet Thomas's gaze, his eyes calm, steady, as though responding to something deeper than words. Thomas gave the faintest nod, more to himself than to anyone else, and his hand rested once more along the dog's neck, the gesture familiar, grounding, and in that small moment, The connection between past and present felt closer, more real. The clock ticked on, the sound steady, unchanged, and outside. The night settled fully, wrapping the house in a quiet stillness that did not intrude, only surround it. Margaret looked at Thomas with a gentle understanding, her voice soft when she finally spoke. "He stayed with you," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet recognition, and Thomas did not answer right away, his gaze lingering on Rex, on the calm presence beside him, and then he gave a small nod, his voice low when he spoke. "He did," he said simply. The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It carried something more now, something shared, something understood without needing to be explained, and in that quiet space, it became clear that some bonds do not end when time moves forward. They remain, carried in memory, in instinct, in the quiet recognition of a presence that feels familiar even when the world has changed. And as Rex settled once more at Thomas's side, his breathing slow and steady, it felt as though the past had not been left behind, but had found a way to return, not as something lost, but as something that had always been waiting to be seen again. Sometimes the moment we think we lost something forever is the very moment it finds its way back to us in another form. The room held that truth quietly, as if it had always known it would be spoken, and Thomas Hale sat still with his hand resting against Rex's neck, the warmth of the dog steady beneath his fingers, grounding him in a way that words never quite could. The clock continued its slow, patient ticking, each second passing without urgency, and the soft light from the lamp seemed to settle deeper into the room, wrapping everything in a calm that felt almost protective. Margaret Quinn remained where she was, her presence gentle, her gaze thoughtful, and she watched Thomas not with curiosity, but with a kind of understanding that came from seeing beyond what was spoken. Thomas's eyes lingered on Rex, studying him now in a way that was more deliberate, more searching, as though something within him had begun to connect threads that had long been left apart. Rex met his gaze without hesitation, his amber eyes steady, calm, carrying a quiet intelligence that did not demand recognition, only offered it. Thomas's hand moved slightly, brushing along the dog's fur, and there was a subtle shift in his expression, something deeper, something that had not been there before, as if a question had formed without being spoken. "You ever notice," Thomas said slowly, his voice thoughtful, almost distant, "how some dogs respond before you even give the command?" Margaret nodded gently, her eyes soft, though she did not interrupt, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "It is not training," Thomas added after a moment, his gaze still on Rex. "Not entirely. It is something else." The words settled quietly, and Rex's ears flicked slightly, as though he recognized the tone more than the meaning, his body remaining calm, his presence unchanged. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair, though his hand did not leave the dog, and his eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in focus, as though he was seeing something more clearly now than he had before. "Carter used to do that," he said, his voice lower, more certain. "Before I even spoke, he would already know." The room seemed to grow quieter at that, as if the air itself had paused to listen, and Margaret's expression shifted just slightly, not in surprise, but in quiet recognition of the connection forming. Thomas exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and his gaze moved between Rex and the space in front of him, as though the present and the past were no longer separate, but overlapping in a way that felt both familiar and unexpected. Rex shifted closer, his body leaning just slightly into Thomas's leg, the contact gentle but intentional, and Thomas felt it. Of course, the quiet reassurance, the steady presence, and his hand moved again, this time more firmly, resting along the dog's shoulder, as if confirming something that did not need to be said aloud. "It is not the same dog," Thomas murmured, almost to himself, the words careful, measured, but he did not finish the sentence, because he did not need to. The meaning already present in the way he looked at Rex, in the way his hand remained where it was, in the way the room held its silence without interruption. Margaret watched him closely, her voice soft when she finally spoke. "Some things are not meant to be the same," she said gently, "only to remind us of what we thought we lost." The words settled into the space between them, and Thomas gave a faint nod, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, as if something within him had shifted just enough to allow that idea to take root. Rex lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Thomas's again, and there was something in that look, something steady and unwavering, as though the dog understood the moment in a way that did not require explanation. Thomas's posture eased just a little more, his shoulders lowering. The tension that had once been constant now softened into something quieter, something more at rest. Outside, the night had fully settled, the faint sound of wind brushing against the house steady and calm, and inside, the warmth remained unchanged, holding the moment in a way that felt almost deliberate. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his hand still resting on Rex, and for a moment, he simply stayed there, not speaking, not moving, as if allowing himself to exist fully in that space without needing to retreat from it. Margaret smiled faintly, not because anything had been resolved, but because something had begun, something small but real, and she leaned back in her chair once more, giving the moment the room it needed to settle. And in that quiet, where no one rushed to define what was happening and nothing needed to be proven, it became clear that sometimes the most important connections are not the ones we recognize immediately, but the ones that slowly reveal themselves, piece by piece, until we are ready to see them for what they truly are. In the end, it is not the loud moments that change a life, but the quiet ones where something finally chooses to stay. The night had settled fully around Margaret Quinn's home, the world outside reduced to soft shadows and distant silence, while inside, the steady glow of the lamp held its warmth without fading, casting a gentle light across the room, where Thomas Hale remained seated, his hand still resting along Rex's neck as if the connection between them had become something he no longer questioned, only accepted. The clock continued its patient rhythm, each second marking not just the passing of time, but the quiet unfolding of something deeper, something that had not arrived suddenly, but had built itself slowly, piece by piece, until it could no longer be ignored. Thomas's gaze lingered on Rex, not searching now, not uncertain, but calm, as though whatever question had once formed within him had found its answer not in words, but in presence, in the steady loyalty of the dog beside him, in the way Rex remained without needing to be told, without needing to be asked. Rex met his gaze with the same quiet certainty, his amber eyes steady, his breathing slow, and there was no hesitation in him, no doubt, only a calm awareness that seemed to exist beyond the moment itself, as if he understood something that did not need to be explained. Margaret watched them both from across the table, her expression soft, her hands resting gently in her lap, and there was a quiet satisfaction in her presence, not because she had changed anything, but because she had allowed something to unfold without interference, without rushing it into something it was not ready to become. Thomas exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and his shoulders lowered just slightly, the last trace of tension easing into something that felt closer to rest than it had in a long time. "I used to think," he said quietly, his voice carrying a calm reflection, "that once something was gone, it stayed gone." The words settled into the room, simple but weighted, and Margaret listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. Thomas's hand moved slightly along Rex's fur, not searching, not testing, but familiar now, grounded, and he continued, "But maybe that is not how it works." Rex shifted just enough to press closer, his body leaning into Thomas with a quiet assurance, and the gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried a meaning that filled the space more than any explanation could. Margaret gave a gentle nod, her voice soft when she spoke. "Sometimes what we lose does not return the same way," she said, her tone calm, certain, "but it finds another path back to us." Thomas looked at her then, really looked, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something lighter, something that had not replaced the past, but had made room beside it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, carrying a sense of quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud, and for a moment, no one moved, no one felt the need to. Outside, the wind softened, the night settling into a deeper stillness, and inside, the warmth remained unchanged, holding the moment as if it knew it mattered. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture no longer guarded, no longer ready to leave at a moment's notice, but steady, present, and Rex lowered himself beside him. His body relaxed, his head resting gently near Thomas's foot. The quiet companionship now fully settled into something real, something lasting. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her movements careful but unhurried, and she moved toward the small lamp near the wall, adjusting it just slightly so that the light softened even more. The room now wrapped in a calm that felt almost like a promise. Thomas watched her for a moment, then let his gaze return to Rex, his hand resting once more along the dog's neck. And this time, there was no hesitation in the gesture, no question behind it, only acceptance. The clock ticked on, the sound steady, unchanging, and the night continued beyond the walls of the house. But inside, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, something quiet yet profound, something that did not need to be explained because it was already understood. And as Thomas sat there, no longer alone, no longer standing at the edge of something uncertain, it became clear that sometimes the miracle is not in what returns, but in the simple moment when a man realizes he does not have to walk away anymore, because at last, something has chosen to stay.